All right, here's some painting techniques I want you to try. In your sketchbook, just write painting techniques at the top like this, and then you can label these other parts as you go. Feel free to pause anytime if I'm going too fast, you can catch up. All right, so for wet on dry, I want you to start with really any color. Put it on there and kind of spread it out so it's nice and flat, nice and smooth, mostly so it will dry more quickly. Rinse your brush, and we're going to come back to that to finish that later. Now for the wet on wet, I guess you didn't need to rinse your brush. You can use the same color if you want to. Put some of that same color, it doesn't have to be yellow, whichever color you've got. Put that same color on there for the wet on wet. And now rinse your brush. Before that dries, I want you to get a different color. I'm going to use a pinkish color. And while that's still wet, we're going to put some wet, different color. All right, so the yellow is wet, and this pink color is also wet. Kind of mess around with it a little bit, blend it a little bit, and leave it at that. We will come back to the wet on dry in a little bit, and then we'll compare the wet on wet to the wet on dry. Now what I want you to do is take one of your brushes, whichever one you think looks the most frizzy at the tip. You can't really see this one's kind of blurry here, but the bristles on this are sort of frizzy and frayed apart from each other a bit. That's going to be good for this dry brushing part. What I want you to do is take that brush in your paint, try to dip just the tips of the bristles in there, just a little bit on the tips. And if you got too much, feel free to wipe it off on some paper towel if you need to wipe off some of the excess. We're going to do this dry brushing technique now. First thing I want you to try is just with the tip of the brush, make some marks. And you notice once you start to lose some of that paint, the marks get a little bit more speckled. And eventually they'll kind of disappear. So that's dry brushing with the tip of the brush. Now try dry brushing with longer strokes. Notice how it's kind of streaky. It's not a solid mark. Now this is because the brush is dry, there's no water in the brush, and there's just a little bit of paint on the brush. It'll make marks like this. Next to that, let's try getting your brush wet. So I got some water on my brush. I'm going to get that same color. And now, notice the difference between the marks. They're a lot more blotchy, less separate. The streakiness is still there a little bit, but it looks different, right? These kind of marks are less streaky than these. These, with the tip of the brush, are more put together, more solid looking than these. So the dry brushing is these first two examples here. And that just means it's like a textural technique. You can use that to add texture. These over here are with a wet brush, which is fine too. It depends on what look you're going for. Now, don't let that paint dry on your brush. You want to rinse that out fairly quickly. Okay, you can use any brush for this, and I want you to, just with a good bit of paint on there, I want you to use just the tip of the brush to make some marks. And I want you to try this with more than one brush. Try just doing little marks. Try doing bigger marks by pressing harder. Careful not to press too hard to damage your bristles, okay? Press too hard, that's going to bend the bristles too much. And try a different brush. Any color's fine. Again, just the tip of your brush. This has longer bristles, so every time I make a mark, I can make a bigger mark, more spread out. Again, that can be used for texture or just marks or little shapes. Now I'd like you to try using the edge of the brush. That before was the tip of the brush. Now we're going to use the edge. So with your paint, I want you to get your brush in there and try to get paint on the edge, kind of like this. And then you're going to use the edge to make some marks. Try doing something kind of cool with it, like putting them all in a design or pattern of some kind. Try getting some more paint on there if you need it, and using the edge of the brush, but kind of sideways like this. Notice how each time I make a mark, there's less and less paint on the brush. So I need to sometimes reload the paint. All right, so that's just really quick. Different paint techniques. We'll probably learn others as we go. But let's go back to the wet on dry. So I'm going to go back and use the same second color that I did from the wet on wet, but now I'm going to put that same color on the wet on dry. So I used that pink color. If I use that pink color on the wet on dry, this is dry by now. And if I put this pink color on here, again, just kind of mess around with it a little bit. Let's compare how that looks compared to the wet on wet. The wet on wet is more blended. That pink with the yellow turned into sort of an orange. The wet on dry, it's not going to blend in there. It's going to be less orange looking. But since the paint is somewhat transparent, you still can see a little bit of difference of color now. It does look a little bit orangish, but not as much as this one does. Okay, try that for yourself.